Well, thank you very much, Paul, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm here to talk about my favorite subject, of course, the future of renewable energy. And this report, which I spent the last 2 years writing, I'm now on something of a global tour to talk about this report. I just spent the last 5 weeks with various speaking events in Japan, and that's why some of my slides are also English-Japanese, because I live there, and I've actually spent the last 5 weeks presenting almost entirely in Japanese in terms of the slides. So we'll get into the future of renewable energy, and I think one of the messages that came from doing this work for me was that our thinking about renewable energy, the current situation, and also our thinking about the future of renewable energy, our thinking is really out of date. We're not thinking according to the current situation, the current realities, the current ways in which people in the field and industry are really thinking about the future. Many of us are thinking 5, 10, even 20 years behind the times. And that's especially true in Japan, I've discovered these last few weeks. Before I talk about the future itself, let me just give you a very brief overview of the current status of renewable energy. And that's based on the Renewables Global Status Report, which you can also find on the ren21.net site. On the back of the report, there's a web address, ren21.net. And you can find this report, which I created and wrote for the first 6 years from 2005 till 2010. And this report pretty much has everything in terms of the current situation. By the way, if you want to find all of these things, you can also go to my own website, martinot.info. Just Google Renewable Energy ERIC, and it'll come up first. Actually, now it's a good information site. So the current status of renewable energy, about 17% share of total global energy today. That includes electricity, heating, transport, all forms of energy, about 17%. And about half of that 17%, or 8%, is so-called modern renewables. That's what we're talking about today: solar, wind, biomass, geothermal, hydro. The traditional biomass, if you study rural development and renewable energy in rural areas of developing countries, you find a still large use of traditional biomass for cooking and for heating. This is fuel wood, dung, agricultural waste, these types of things, charcoal. And if you look at the breakdown of that 8% modern renewables, you find, well, hydro is about 3%. That's not growing very fast. That's about the same as nuclear. Nuclear is about 2.7%. So we actually get about the same amount of energy from hydropower as from nuclear power today. Wind, solar, biomass, geothermal, that's this 1%. It's growing very fast, however, and that's what I'm going to talk mostly about today, plus the heating. Heating from biomass and geothermal is actually quite a large share. People don't realize how much heat energy we're currently getting from geothermal, from biomass, from solar. If you look at the picture just for share of electricity, you find about 20% share of electricity from renewables. Most of that is hydropower, 15%. But again, the 5% non-hydro, which is solar, wind, biomass, geothermal, this is growing very fast. And nuclear doesn't show on here, but nuclear is about 14%. So as I said, nuclear and hydro are about the same. So that just gives you a rough idea in terms of where we are in terms of shares of renewables today. And again, you can find all of these diagrams in the Global Status Report. Renewable energy has been growing very fast. We've seen growth rates of 20 to 70% annually for the last 7, 8, 9 years even. And in particular for solar PV, solar electric power, we saw a growth rate 75%, almost a doubling of the total solar capacity in the world in 1 year, in 2011, compared to an average growth rate of roughly 50 to 60% annually. Wind power has been growing at between 20 and 30% annually over all these years. And you can see that this is a graph of wind power capacity. And you can find in the last 7 or 8 years a pretty consistent 25% average annual growth rate, something like that. Solar PV, again, almost doubled in 1 year from 40 to 70 gigawatts in 2011. And just to give you some frame of reference, when I use the word gigawatt, for those of you who aren't energy people, a gigawatt is a unit of capacity. It's like one coal power plant. And there are about 5,000 gigawatts in the world from all forms of electric generation combined. If you look at the whole world, it's about 5,000. Maybe I think we're up to about 5,200, something like that. The US is about 900, something like that, gigawatts, roughly speaking. So just to give you some frame of reference, wind power is up to actually 280 as of last year. This was for 2011, but the 2012 numbers are still to come out. But we're up to about 280 gigawatts of wind power globally, and about 100 gigawatts for solar PV. Again, another 30 gigawatts in 2012. So as of the end of last year, we're up to about 100 gigawatts of solar PV. And nobody 10 years ago predicted that solar PV would do this, that we'd see 30 gigawatts added in 1 year, or that we'd get up to 100 gigawatts. If you asked most, or you looked at projections, we might have been supposed to get to this level in the year 2020, or even 2030. If you look at most projections of today, made 10 years ago, they were either an order of magnitude too low, or a decade, later than what actually happened. Solar heating, solar thermal, solar panels on the roof that provide heating and hot water. That's a large market, but it's mostly China. So 80% of the global market is in China. And you find smaller markets, particularly in Europe now. This is growing a lot. But the Chinese market, this is a city in China. I think this is Yunnan. I'm sorry, Kunming city. You find large areas of the cities with basically solar on every rooftop. And it's really cheap in China. That's one of the reasons. Still continuing on the current situation, investment. So the world is now investing $260 billion annually in new renewable energy capacity. That's this $260 billion here. Last year about the same, maybe a little bit less actually. That's up from $40 billion in 2004, so a seven-fold increase in less than 10 years. That $260 billion is more than the world invests in fossil fuel and nuclear power generation combined. So renewable energy is now the majority of investment in the power generation sector globally. If you look at the total global investment in fossil fuels and nuclear last year, compare that to the total global investment in renewable energy was higher. And it's been that way for the last 3 years, since 2010. Every year since 2010, investment in renewable energy has been higher than investment in fossil fuels and nuclear combined. And this shocks most people. Like, how could that be? Renewable energy, we know that is some fringe technology. These environmentalists like it. It's some insignificant part of our energy system. No, we're talking about the majority of global investment. We're talking about in Europe last year, 80% of all the power capacity that was added in Europe last year was renewable. And only 20% was fossil fuel or nuclear. Very little nuclear, mostly fossil fuel. But 80% of all the added power capacity in Europe was renewable. So this is no longer some fringe. This is actually the majority of what we're doing today. This is not only mainstream, this is mainly what's happening. And I think that message alone is slow to sink in. If you look at where the investment is going, it is very uneven. So there are some major countries, the US, China, Germany, Italy, last year or 2011 were the leaders. India to a lesser extent. The US actually has seen much greater investment in just the last couple of years as a consequence of the solar PV market here and also the wind market continuing to increase. So the US is actually doing relatively well these last couple of years compared to what it had been doing before. And finally, to round out the picture in terms of the global situation, this is a chart, you can't read it, but these are the 10 most common types of policies to support renewable energy here across the top. And then here you have all the countries, and there are 5 more charts like this in the report showing that 120 countries around the world have some type of policy to promote renewable energy. So most countries around the world, certainly all the developed countries, and now of that 120, most are developing countries now, countries around the world have some type of policy to support renewable energy. And most countries have more than one policy. So you can find that most countries have several policies in parallel. And that's true here in the US, where you see combinations of state-level policies, federal policies. If you've been taking an energy policy or environmental policy class, you may be aware of the kinds of policies we see here in the US now. actually have existed for a number of years. And the policies have really been driving all of the market growth that I've shown you over the last decade, last 15 years, especially in Europe. I won't get into that, but this just gives you some frame of reference for where we are today. Let me shift to talking about the future. So I wrote that global status report for 6 years in terms of where we are today. And after writing about the current situation for 6 years, I decided to write about the future. So what would I do? Well, I didn't want to just write one scenario or my own view, but I wanted to do a comprehensive inventory of all the views that exist today about the future of renewable energy, from oil companies to Greenpeace, from the International Energy Agency to scientific studies. And so what I did is I put together a team. We looked at 5,000 pages of recently published scenarios from this range of organizations, about 50 recently published scenarios from the last 2 or 3 years. I personally went around the world and I interviewed 150 people for an hour or 2 hours and asked them the question, how do you see the future of renewable energy? How do you see that? What does it look like to you? And these were academics and researchers, of course, but also CEOs of renewable energy companies, parliamentarians, policymakers, industry people. Basically, I tried to get a fairly comprehensive picture. I ended up with 1,000 pages of interview notes, and it took me almost all of last year to figure out how to put those 5,000 pages of scenarios and 1,000 pages of notes into 40 pages. So it took me 2 years to write this, but you can read it in 2 hours. And it's a linear version. I mean, it's basically, there's 6 chapters, and I'll give you a taste of what's in a couple of the chapters, and then you can certainly read it. So what does the report show? What did I find? Well, first of all, looking at all these scenarios, you can sort of group the scenarios into 3 major ranges. The conservative scenarios, which are typically in the 15 to 20% range. Long term, this is 2030, 2035, 2040. Those are very conservative. Those tend to be by the IEA, the International Energy Agency, historically, by government agencies like US Department of Energy, by oil companies. Here's ExxonMobil. Then the middle range, we call moderate, is maybe 30 to 50% share. This is share of total global energy from renewables. So remember I said today we're at about 17%. So we're at about 17% today, and this is share in the far future. Then there's a whole range, a whole number of scenarios in the middle range, 30 to 50%. And notable is an IEA scenario, ETP. This is a climate stabilization scenario. It basically works backwards from 2 degrees of global warming over some, I think it's 2050. And that shows 40% share of renewables in the long term. And that's quite remarkable given the IEA was noted for low scenarios in the past. Okay, ExxonMobil we can understand and perhaps excuse for having a low scenario. To them, the future remains fossil fuel based. But the IEA has really been changing its viewpoints in the last 5 years or so. Then you find, of course, many high scenarios. Certainly Greenpeace does a very comprehensive global scenario now called Energy Revolution, which paints a very detailed picture of both global and national scenarios for a number of countries. And that scenario goes up to 80% share by 2050. But you also find many other scenarios in this range. The IPCC did a report on renewable energy a couple years ago, and they collected a whole collection of 100 scenarios, 100 climate scenarios, and a lot of those had also high shares of renewables. The GEA, Global Energy Assessment, was a major scientific study that took them, I think, 5 years and involved hundreds of people, and they came out with a number of scenarios. Anyway, in Annex 2 of the report, you can find a whole list of all the scenarios that are covered and the references to them. But the point here is that whereas in the past it might have been credible to say, well, we might only get to 20% or 25% in the long term, whereas in the past these kinds of scenarios might have been credible. If you look at the technology status, the market status that I've showed you before, the investments, the technology cost reductions that have happened recently and are expected to happen in the future, if you look at the detailed scenario work that many have done, you really can't call these scenarios credible anymore. They just don't hold up, given the current situation. Instead, you really have to say that all the scenarios in the sort of middle range are now almost where we're starting from. Like, it's almost certain that we're going to get to this middle range, to the 30 to 50% range. That almost seems certain now. If you talk with experts, if you look at government targets and policies and so on. And then the only question is, are we going to reach the high range? Are we going to get up to 50 to 80%, 50, 60, 70, 80%, as some of these high scenarios are projecting? And so I think that's a shift in our thinking, too, from this sort of range as the baseline. Now, this chart is share of total energy, including transportation and heating and cooling. If you just look at electricity alone, and this is also in Chapter 1, you find these are shares of electricity generation by itself, just share of electricity. And you find similarly scenarios. Here's the EU. The European Commission has a scenario, 35% share of electricity, up from the current 22% by 2030. Here's the IEA itself with a projection 45%. Here's an industry group in Europe, 65% share of electricity. And you can find a range of scenarios for different countries. That's these projections, these dark green ones. And you find targets. So these German targets are very interesting. So the German government has said that in Germany, by 2020, 35% of all electricity will come from renewables. By 2035, 50% of all electricity will come from renewables. And by 2050, 80% of all electricity will come from renewables. This is a German government policy target. The German government is saying, we can do this. And so that's when I say that the low range is really no longer credible, that we're sort of looking at somewhere in here, because even the German government is saying that we can do this, that we can reach 80% electricity share. And Germany and Denmark has said they're going to get 100% share of renewables. I think it's by 2040. So the utility company in Denmark is already working towards 100% renewables. The utility company. So to them, it's not a question of if anymore. To them, it's going to happen. It's just a question, how do we do it? What are the detailed technical steps we have to go through? How long is it going to take? Okay, it'll cost a little more maybe, but they're working on it. It's a problem to be solved now. It's not a question to say, well, should we do it or should we not do it? And the same in Germany. Many people are hard at work on how Germany is going to achieve this 80% share. Of course, the fact that they canceled all of their plans for nuclear power development and basically said we're going to be nuclear free, this was after the Fukushima accident, helped a lot also. But you find a number of countries that really have high targets for electricity in the 30 to 50% range. South Africa. In South Africa, there's an official government target. This is by the utility company that 38% of all the added capacity in South Africa will be renewable energy over the next 20 years. 38% of all the new capacity will be renewable. So it's not just the rich countries either, or the developed countries. So that's the first chapter. This is how much renewables and what do we consider credible? What are scenarios showing us? There are many recent published scenarios that are in the high ranges. Second aspect of the report I'll bring today is investment. So when I talked with investment experts, with finance experts, I went to London, I went to New York. These are people who are making investments on a daily basis. Okay, how do you see the future of investment in renewable energy? Many of them said it's going to double by 2020, by 2025, certainly by 2030, but most said 2020 or 2025, investment in renewable energy will double from today's levels. So that means getting up to $400 or $500 billion annually. This is a Bloomberg New Energy Finance, BNEF. They have projection by 2020, $400 billion investment in renewables, up from today's 260. And Bloomberg New Energy Finance, BNEF, is actually one of the most, I would say, they're really doing a good job trying to look at the investment trends and what's happening, and I find them very credible. Experts said, okay, there are many new sources of finance. We can't use the existing sources of finance alone. If we're going to get to $500 billion investment annually, we can't continue to use the existing sources of finance. That's basically bank lending, and then utilities themselves financing investments using their own balance sheet, basically their own cash flow to make investments on their own. So we've seen mostly banks lending and utility balance sheet finance so far, but experts pointed to a variety of new sources of finance, and that includes, for example, pension funds. So if renewable energy investments were rated AA, AAA. They could be sold to pension funds in large blocks. And the point here is that renewable energy investments are beginning to be seen as the lowest risk energy investment of all. So if you own a coal power plant in Germany today, this is considered a very risky investment. Why? Because solar power, solar PV, is now supplying half of the total power consumption in the daytime in Germany. Their solar PV market has advanced to the point where on some days solar PV is supplying half the total power load. And if you own a coal power plant, you have to keep turning your coal plant off or lower every single day. The coal plants are being cycled every day in Germany, actually in Denmark and France too. But this is called cycling of conventional plants. Utilities normally like to run them full out at full capacity, but in Germany they have to curtail them in the daytime. And if you own one of these coal power plants, if you're a utility that has them, you may go bankrupt because your revenue is way down. You're losing income on a fixed investment. And so coal power plants in Germany and throughout Europe are now coming to be seen as very risky. The revenue side of it is uncertain, and certainly you don't know what the future price of coal will be. So if you build a coal power plant, you basically are committing yourself to buying 30 years worth of coal. If you don't know what the price of coal is for the next 30 years, and of course we don't, you might have to buy a hedging contract to buy 30 years worth of coal, and how much is that going to cost you? But there's a significant risk in that. Renewable energy has no risk. You build it, it's there, the wind farm is there, you're going to get power output for the next 25 years. There's no extra cost except for a little bit of maintenance. So the idea is that many of these funds will start to see renewables as low-risk investment, maybe even inflation hedges because your fixed costs are paid for already. And so once inflation maybe starts to come back around the world, who knows when that might be, you can basically sell power at a low price and undercut people even in inflationary times. So we'll start to see more of these sources come in. Oil companies even, they have large funds to invest, which they're investing in upstream oil and gas investment and so on. But oil companies could spend a lot. And we see token investments by oil companies over these last few years. Total oil company in France committed $2 billion in renewable energy for a 5-year period. But $2 billion is small compared to the hundreds of billions that are flowing to renewables, compared to Total's own upstream oil and gas investments. It's nothing. So oil companies could do a lot more. And then, I won't get into this, but many new types of business models, new types of utility companies, micro-utilities, third-party energy services, mobility services, community cooperative ownership, all kinds of new business models that people pointed to that would be using these new sources of finance. So I'll leave the investment picture like this for now. That's chapter 3 of the report. Now, let me come to a third aspect, which I'll share with you today, and that is something very interesting. When I started, I thought about, okay, what's the role of wind power manufacturers and solar PV manufacturers and battery manufacturers? What I didn't expect is such a large role for existing companies, that there's a very large role for all of these kinds of companies in the future of renewable energy. And that was something I wasn't quite prepared to think about, but I think it's a very important message. And the role is what I would call integration of renewable energy into existing infrastructure, and that's really chapter 2 of the report. And for example, electric utilities. So electric utilities for the last 100 years have been suppliers of a commodity, kilowatt hours of electricity. They produce a commodity, people buy it from them. That's what they've seen as their role, production and sales. In the future, electricity utilities will become much more complicated than that. They'll essentially be managers of very complicated power systems with distributed generation, centralized generation, microgrids, centralized grids, modular units, a lot of flexibility, a lot of different kinds of services and pricing and levels of grid integration, storage in different parts of the grid. And somebody has to manage all of that. And so electric utilities essentially become power managers or managers of this complicated system. Electric vehicles, charging, being plugged in, selling their power, using their batteries for storage to balance variable renewables and so on. And part of that role is this notion of balancing variable renewables. So we're all aware that wind and solar is not constant. You see sort of, these large variations on daily and weekly and seasonal basis. And one of the major objections by utilities in the past to renewable energy has been this variability, which used to be called intermittent. Renewables are intermittent. Well, actually, experts said to me, well, you can call nuclear power intermittent, actually, because a nuclear power plant can shut off just like that and you have no control over it if it goes offline, if it trips offline. So actually, we're using this word variable, meaning, yes, it's variable. It can be high, it can be low, and it does vary over time. Now, when I started this research, when I started all the interviews, I thought, okay, high levels of renewables in the future, we're going to need energy storage. Energy storage is going to be the key. With energy storage, we can do everything. And many people think this way. And most of Japan thinks this way, I've discovered. But energy storage is just one option on a whole list of options, a whole dozen other options for balancing variable renewables. For example, demand response. So a utility makes an agreement with its customers that it can shut off some of their load. If I own a large refrigeration plant, maybe it's perfectly fine with me to shut off those refrigerators for an hour because there's heat storage or cool storage in there. And so it's fine with me for the utility to shut off my refrigerators or my freezers for an hour and turn them on later. And if I give the utility that option to control those loads itself, and maybe I get a discounted rate for doing that, then the utility has a way not to supply power when the wind power goes down or the clouds obscure the sun, but rather, instead of the utility providing more supply, the utility can shut off some of the demand. And that's called demand response, and you find that happening today. The state of Texas, for example, half of their regulatory reserve is provided through demand response. And likewise, I could explain all of these. You can find this in Chapter 2, actually. But the point is that all of these options are already being done today around the world somewhere. Utilities are already doing all of these things. And so we don't need to wait for better energy storage or cheaper energy storage. We can actually achieve high shares of renewable energy today using all of these options without much energy storage. And if you look at scenarios that have been published in recent years, Rocky Mountain Institute here in Colorado, even NREL itself, you can find scenarios which show large shares of renewable energy, up to 80% shares, with very little storage, because they've modeled in their scenarios using all of these other options in various combinations. And so we don't really need that energy storage. And utilities, the role of utility companies needs to become as experts, as masters, as advocates for doing all of this. And utilities are not doing this yet. Most of them are not. But they could very easily do it. They don't necessarily want to do it. They don't necessarily like to do it. But this is the future. They're going to do it. Those who learn to do it will continue to lead. And those who don't learn to do it will either follow or perish or, in a sense, suffer in the long run. And that's just the way it's going to be. I mean, that's pretty clear to most people now. So that's an example of the role of electric utilities. Now, oil companies, I've already mentioned in terms of finance and investment, sources of finance. Also, oil companies want to be producing biofuels, ethanol and biodiesel, liquid fuels for transportation from biomass. And so we see a role for oil companies there. But oil companies also have a potential role in offshore wind power. Now, offshore wind power is more expensive than conventional onshore wind power, you know, on plains and mountains and so on. It's more expensive, but the cost is not the turbine itself. The turbine here is only about 1/3 of the total cost of the offshore wind power. The rest of the cost involves the offshore construction, the logistics, the servicing, the operation, the maintenance costs. It's still not as reliable. It still involves extra costs. And the role of oil companies, I'm going to allow for questions at the end. The role of oil companies in doing this, they could reduce the cost of offshore wind power because of their logistics expertise. They do this all the time with offshore drilling platforms. They could convert that and turn that into expertise in terms of offshore wind power. So that's a really interesting role for for oil companies. Automakers, similarly, a large role for automakers in terms of the next generation of electric vehicles, small, lightweight, maybe made of carbon fiber, can go very far on small batteries, high degree of service. We see every auto company in the world now planning to come out with an electric vehicle. As of today, there are, I don't know, 6 or 7 or 8 companies producing electric vehicles around the world, but every auto company is planning to produce one, and in various sizes: 2 wheels, 3 wheels, 4 wheels, small, large. You find electric motorcycles, you find electric motorbikes. I lived in China for 3 years, 2005 through 2008, and over that 3-year period, I saw an increasing number of electric motorbikes and motor scooters on the streets of Beijing. By the time I left, there were very few gasoline internal combustion motorbikes left. It was all electric. These are bikes, people take the battery out, they take it up to their apartment, they charge it up overnight, come back, put the battery back the next morning. And so we're seeing this proliferation of electric vehicles, and you can integrate the cars with the power grid. You can use the batteries in the cars, if you have millions of cars, as a source of stability for power grids. The so-called vehicle-to-home concept, you run your home off of your car. All of these things are possible, but they require the participation and the work of the auto industry. So they're on this list. Building material manufacturers. Building material manufacturers. This is a diagram of a house using renewable energy in various ways. Once you have mass markets, once you have good business models, it costs a lot more today because nobody's doing it, so everything is custom, one of a kind. It's really hard to find. You have to pay people extra to do the design. But once this becomes standard, once you can find it in architectural catalogs, in building materials catalogs, once you can buy roofing materials with the solar built into it, so-called building integrated PV materials for large commercial buildings. If you're an architect specifying architectural glass for the side of the buildings, if you can open a catalog and find solar glass, but the same price as normal glass, you can put that on and you get the benefit of the solar and the electricity from the glass without any extra cost, essentially, because the glass is so much more expensive than the solar itself. And all of these things, there's a role for building materials manufacturers to come out with new kinds of building materials. There's a role for architects. There's a role for building, planning, new codes, zoning, local building regulations, local requirements, new ways of doing this that lower costs. It's not a question of technology. It's not a question of economics, really. It's all the other stuff that needs to happen. And that's what people said over and over again to me. We have all the technologies we need to get to 2050 even, high shares of renewable energy. We don't need any new technology for that. And renewables have gotten to the point where they're just about as cheap as everything else. For example, solar glass, building materials with large economies of scale. It's not a question of economics anymore. It's a question of policy. It's a question of the institutions. It's a question of the business models, the finance, the integration, getting the utilities to agree to do all those things that I talked about before, to see their roles in new ways. It's almost a generational perception issue in terms of what is our role? What are we here to do if I work for a utility, if I manage a utility company? I guess I should probably allow time for questions now, but let me just mention also the role of IT companies, because this was really interesting. And of course, IT companies, we all have heard about the smart grid and the role of IT and smart metering, which has a bad name right now, but the sort of ways in which all of these kinds of integration options will happen in the future really does require IT. But beyond that, beyond the smart grid, we saw IT in a variety of different sectors. For example, the wind industry. The wind industry today is already one of the largest users of supercomputers in the world. Not just to design their turbine, but for siting. If you can site the turbines in the proper way, so you get anti-correlation of wind flows, and so you can actually have, for a given wind farm, you can have the most constant output. It's less variable because of where you've put the turbines. and you use computing power to figure that out. There are hundreds of maintenance of monitoring points on a given turbine, so you can figure out when it's going to break and where before it happens. Because a large part of wind power maintenance is in terms of downtime. When something breaks and it's going to take a while to fix it because you want to fix it all together, you have a large wind farm. So if you can predict when these things are going to break and replace them before they break, you save a lot. And so that's sort of predictive maintenance. And they use a lot of computing power for that. So roles of different types of companies. The last thing I'll say is simply that the costs of the technologies themselves have come down so much in the last 10 years, the last 5 years, the last 3 years. Solar PV 4 years ago was $3 per watt. So one of these panels might be 120 watts, let's say, but the cost was about $3 per watt in terms of the solar PV panel itself. Today, the cost is less than $1 per watt. So the cost has dropped by a factor of 3 in the last 4 years. And the world has not caught up with this fact. The world has not caught up with the fact that it's now as cheap to produce electricity from solar as it is to buy electricity from your retail supplier in some places around the world without any subsidies. And that's called grid parity. Grid parity means that the cost of generating power from solar equals the price you pay for electricity. And we find grid parity now in places like Hawaii, in Spain, in parts of the US. And in Spain, for example, everybody wants to put solar PV on the roof and sell their power to the utility without any subsidy. They're dying to do this because the price of power that they can generate is less than what they're paying the utility company. So they're all dying to do this. There's no policy in Spain that allows them to sell their power to the utility. There's no policy that requires the utility to buy the power from them. It's called net metering. It's a net metering policy. It exists in the US, pretty much everywhere in the US. The utilities are required to buy the power from you, even without any subsidies involved. In Spain, it's not true. People are dying to put this on their roof and sell the power to the utility, but there's no policy to allow them to do that. And one of the reasons is that the utilities are lobbying the government not to do that because they're so afraid they're going to lose their market share to their own customers for so much solar PV, and the utilities are going to be in big trouble, declining revenue. So there's this clash now in terms of the costs, and the costs have come down a lot in just recent years. $1 per watt today, this was the holy grail in the 1980s. People said back then, if solar PV ever gets to $1 per watt, we can't imagine it ever will, but if it does, because it was like $10 back then, if it ever gets to $1 per watt, the game's over. We'll see solar everywhere. Well, that's where we are today. The game is over. And we're going to see solar everywhere. The cost is not the panel anymore. The cost is the installation. The cost is the interconnection requirements, all of this other stuff. Even the cost of the metal framing, people are working to reduce that, because then you start to integrate the building materials themselves with the PV. Then you eliminate the metal framing, all kinds of stuff like that. The balance of system, the inverters, the cabling even. Cabling is a major cost. If you build houses, if you build new houses with the cables already built into the walls to connect this stuff, it becomes much cheaper. So this is what we're talking about now. Not the cost of the technology itself, but getting architects to build houses with cabling built in for solar panels, essentially is where we are. Okay, I think I'll leave it at that. I had some other slides. Here's wind power. Wind turbines are also becoming competitive with natural gas and coal power generation. We've seen great cost reductions, a lot of new technologies coming in, much more sophisticated. The business community now looks at wind turbines and they said, this is standard industrial risk. This is no different than an auto company or an aircraft company, a wind power company. It's really the same thing now. It's really the same level of standard industrial risk. Solar, concentrating solar thermal power, so-called CSP. This produces steam through the heat. This is a working fluid here, oil or molten salt that gets really hot, several hundred degrees C, and then you use that to generate steam and generate electricity. And in the process, you can store the heat for several hours in large heat collectors, large tanks. And so you can run this plant for 6 or 12 hours after the sun goes down, based on the stored heat from this fluid. And so these plants can basically operate almost 24 hours a day now. It's still more expensive than solar PV. So solar PV is cheaper than CSP, but we're starting to see reductions as well in this technology. Geothermal, biomass in the form of commercial markets for pellets, commercial trade in biomass pellets, and so on. Biofuels. Right now we produce all liquid biofuels, ethanol and biodiesel we see in the US. We're mixing 10% ethanol with all the gasoline in this country. We produce all that ethanol from corn here. Brazil produces it all from sugarcane. That's so-called first-generation biofuels. The report and experts talk about advanced biofuels, so-called advanced biofuels, which is the next generation. You can produce ethanol not from corn, but from agricultural waste, from cellulose. This is just agricultural waste. It's just cellulose. Any sort of agricultural waste, forest products waste, wood chips, anything with cellulose, grass that you can grow on marginal lands that aren't productive for anything else. You can convert all that cellulose into liquid fuels for transport, ethanol basically. And people have been saying that the cellulose to ethanol technology will become commercial shortly. They've been saying that for 10 years now. They still said that to me. Shortly it will be commercial. But the IEA and others pretty much are clear that by 2020 or before, this will be commercial in some fashion, and we'll see much more use. There's billions of tons of agricultural waste, cellulose, around the world that could be used to produce liquid fuels. I won't go into these tables. This is chapter 6, global capacity by 2030. This is global. You can just see the increase. For example, wind power growing by a factor of 12, from 240 to 2,900 gigawatts by 2030. Solar PV growing by a factor of 25, and CSP growing by a factor of 350 by 2030. A similar table for the US alone. You can see the increases in power capacities. And finally, the report has a series of these great debates. So as I was doing the interviewing, these are questions, these are issues that came up again and again. People asked these questions. There were differences of opinions that pointed to these as sort of debates. And I think all of these are relevant for the situation here in the US. All of these are things that people are thinking about today. And all of these are subjects which point to avenues of research. And it would be interesting if we had a lot of time to sort of talk about and outline what are the different areas of research that are pointed to by these various questions. And in fact, there's a total of 30 such great debates in Annex 4 of the report. So I pulled out 10 of them for the body of the report in various boxes. But in the back in Annex 4, there's a total of 30 such debates. And again, they point to interesting avenues of research. So let me leave it at that. See if we have if we have questions. We have nominally 15 minutes, but if you want to stay later, I'm happy to stay until 5:30 even, depending on questions. So I'll turn it back over to you. That's all right. I'll do it. Yeah.
So earlier in the presentation, you showed growth in solar and wind over the last decade looking like it was exponential.
Yep.
And you also mentioned the fact that no one predicted that 10 years ago. So there's a lot of uncertainty in forecasting. The projections that you showed were all straight lines, presumably because it's the easiest thing to do. And none of them include error bars. So do the individual projections include uncertainty? And why are they using straight lines? Is it just because it's the easiest thing to do?
Yeah. This is just a schematic representation. So if you look at the individual scenarios, okay, for Greenpeace it is fairly straight. It sort of levels out a little bit in the last decade, the last 5 years. But by and large, you're right. They do look like straight lines because it's very hard to differentiate what's going to happen from one decade to the next. There are sort of turning points. So you can find in not for total energy so much, But if you look at the scenarios, let's say just for transport, which I don't have here, but you can find definite breakpoints where, let's say, electric vehicles are going to start to really become a large share. And many people projected electric vehicles would start to become a large share of transport only after 2030. So you find a breakpoint around 2030 where electric vehicles start to take hold in large numbers. And there you have larger shares of renewables through renewable electricity powering the electric vehicles. Same thing for advanced biofuels. I mentioned cellulose to ethanol. You have a breakpoint around 2020 or 2025, 2030, depending on when people think advanced biofuels will start to become commercial. And then you start to see larger shares. So you can definitely find this, but by and large, scenarios do look like linear lines. And of course, it's not going to look that way. But I think it's difficult for them to to model those individual changes, sort of decade by decade. It's easier to say, okay, over the long term, this is what's going to happen, and here are growth rates of various things. I mean, part of the difference between these is based on projections of future costs. So how optimistic you are that renewable costs will continue to decline. And you can't really, it's very difficult to model those cost predictions in anything but a linear fashion. In terms of, we can't predict future technology surprises that might represent breakpoints in cost lines. Another difference between these is the level of energy demand or the amount of energy efficiency which is developed over time, because the Greenpeace scenario, for example, shows large reductions in energy demand due to energy efficiency improvements relative to a baseline or reference case, such that by 2050, their total demand, their global energy demand, is not much more than today. Even though there's economic development and population growth and all these things, they basically have energy demand remaining flat or being reduced due to energy efficiency. And that allows them to get to a high share, because if you have total demand remain modest, you can have renewables be a large share of that without so much absolute amount of renewables. Whereas the ExxonMobil case shows huge increase in energy demand, and so it's very hard to meet all of that with renewables. So the absolute amount of renewables may not be that much less than some of the higher cases, but because the energy demand is so high, the share becomes small. And so it's also hard to model changes in energy demand over a multi-decade period with breakpoints. You can't really differentiate, okay, we can see this sort of improvement of 1.5% energy per GDP over some long period of time. But it's kind of hard to break that out too. So I think those are some of the reasons why you see sort of more smooth curves for that. But also it's something of a device just to convey a long-term trend. So does that answer the whole question, or
well, so in regards to all those factors that you mentioned, are these projections incorporating all of that uncertainty? I mean, are they modeling?
Oh, error bars. I didn't see any error bars in any scenarios. No.
Make a projection like this with all these uncertainties.
Well, the way it's, I mean, you might have something to say about this too, Paul, but basically they come up with different scenarios. So scenario 1A, 1B, 2A, 2B, and each scenario has a different set of inputs, a different set of assumptions, different rates of growth, different cost assumptions, and so on. And so they put all those together. And so, for example, the GEA, this is the highest, but they have a dozen other ones. And they're grouped into different categories, high renewables ones and so on. And so that's how they parameterize it in terms of the uncertainty is basically in the input parameters. And so for each set of input parameters, they produce a different scenario. And then they show that whole range of scenarios. And when I'm talking about, when I'm using this graph to sort of simplify, you'll find many scenarios from the GEA in the middle range also. I mean, they basically range, all the way from about 40% up to 80%. An NREL study, they did an electricity future study published last year. NREL did a study showing range in the US between 30 and 90% share of electricity. And so they have different levels of scenarios, different amounts of storage, different amounts of utility integration for all of that. So I think that's, in a sense, this handling of so-called error bars in a different way if you sort of look at most of the kinds of scenario modeling that's done. Yeah.
You seem to indicate that presently we have the technology to get this project done. So the question is that the investment by the government or from the world, what percentage of that investment is going towards like make the technology more efficient, or just to make it like scalable or integrate with the existing one?
Yeah, yeah. Well, there's a couple of different aspects to that. One is most of the $260 billion today is private investment. If you look at even subsidies for renewables, most of those do not come from government budgets. The so-called feed-in tariff policy that provides a guaranteed price for renewable generators, that the extra cost of the renewables is coming from all the utility customers. So in a sense, it's still private. So they're actually, the quantified number for subsidies to renewable energy was about $80 billion in 2011. But of that 80 billion, I'd say no more than half, or even less than half, was actual money coming from government budgets. Subsidies for fossil fuels in 2011 were about $500 billion, or $500 billion, global subsidies for fossil fuels. So we find, an unequal sort of, subsidy picture, but also the vast majority of investment in renewables is coming from private sources. And okay, if we looked at like all the lending by the World Bank and all of the bilateral agencies like USAID and other various sorts of government finance, and the status report has added all that up in the past, we're sort of in the range of 15 or $20 billion annually from all those public sources together versus 260 billion. But that's not to say that public sources of finance won't be very important in the future. Certainly, sovereign wealth funds were mentioned. We can talk about China. We can talk about the oil exporting countries in terms of their large sovereign. But also, in developing countries, this was mentioned a lot. To reduce risk for private investors, many of the finance experts saw large equity investments by governments themselves in developing countries to share in the costs of these projects and to provide confidence and reduce the risks and so on. And so it could be that we will see more equity investment by governments. I don't know whether that's a good thing or not, but I mean, we saw a lot of equity investment by the US government a couple of years ago, right, in various industries here. But people did talk about that in terms of public equity investment. Was that your question, or?
Partly, but I was asking that what percentage of this funding is going towards improving the technology,
yeah.
more efficient, and
well,
what percentage
yeah.
is is there any data on that?
Well, that's research and development spending, and there is some data. The Bloomberg New Energy Finance report, does talk about that, but it is rather difficult actually to split out, in terms of the total level of private R&D spending, and it's even difficult. I tried this once to sort of, put all the data together on public R&D spending from governments around the world. There's no really good central database for it. For OECD, maybe, and you can find that in the Bloomberg numbers. I don't know the numbers offhand, but I think it's in the tens of billions annually in terms of R&D spending. I can't answer it fully. Yeah, thanks. Yeah.
You had a photograph that showed projected for certain questions, certain countries for like 2020 and 2050.
Yeah.
So Brazil, the current right now, is around 80%, 85%. Is
Yeah.
that correct? And if they're doing something differently than other countries, is it practical for other countries to do what they're doing?
Well, it's all hydropower. So that's and large hydropower. And there are a couple of countries that have very large shares already: Iceland, New Zealand, Brazil. It's all from hydropower. Now, Brazil has been doing a lot with solar and wind recently, and they plan. Their target is about the same as their current share. The this gray bar is the target for 2020, so it's about where they are today. But that's in the face of economic growth in which the total power demand is increasing. So they have to continue to increase electricity from renewables, and most of the increase they're planning to come from wind and solar, because the hydro is pretty much developed. Okay, they're working on a lot of small hydro still, and I guess there are still some additional hydro plants. Well, no, I shouldn't say that. I think they actually are planning to increase their hydro by 50% also, if I'm not mistaken, by 2030. So they want to maintain their existing share. And so you can find a lot of countries where the existing high share is from hydro. Germany is an exception. 20% in Germany. Most of that is wind and solar. There isn't that much hydro in Germany. In the US, most of this 12% is still hydropower. And so you have to make this distinction between hydro and then everything else, or some people say large hydro and everything else plus small hydro, because small hydro is growing very fast and is sort of a different investment category. And where we are today, as I said in sort of that overall picture, is hydropower 15% of global electricity, other renewables 5% of global electricity. But that 5% was only 2%, or less than 2%, I guess, 7 or 8 years ago. So that is growing very fast. The hydro is growing, roughly as you might expect, 2 or 3% a year, whereas the wind and solar are growing, as I said, 20, 30, 50, 70%. You had and then Paul.
Okay, so nowadays, was your scenario based, were you planning this for 5 years ago, these estimates? Because right now, we're swimming in cheap natural gas. We're swimming in cheap oil, and that's going to be for the next 30, they project 30, 40, 50 years. I see that as just like, let's postpone all of this for the next 50 years.
Yeah.
What's your answer to that? Please encourage me, because I'm so depressed for the last 9 weeks.
Would you have asked that question 2 years ago?
No, I
No.
wouldn't.
Even last year?
Maybe not.
Yeah. So the fact that we're swimming in these resources is a relatively new outlook here in the U.S., right? And so I'm a bit skeptical about it. I didn't even heard of the word shale gas 5 years ago. And I worked in energy for 25 years. So to me, it's I'm not sure if it's an illusion, but I'm rather skeptical of all the extraordinary claims that have been made in the last year or so. And no, those have not really been reflected yet in these scenarios that have been published in 2010, 2011, 2012 even, where it's a 18-month effort, and people are not going to necessarily take into account, cheap shale gas, is going to swamp out everything else.
Because I've got friends of mine all over the world that are in the PV industry,
Yeah.
and they're saying 60 gigawatts worth of production capacity, 30 gigawatts worth of demand nowadays.
Yeah.
A friend of mine was a bigwig at Solar World.
Yeah.
He says it's 60 cents a watt now. He says, and he can't give it away.
Yeah. I'm skeptical of both the extent and the cost claims in terms of how commercial this is really going to be. I used to think this would just be a passing fad like hydrogen was in the 1990s. Okay, I'm not so sure about that now, but the perspective I would offer on it is that in the long term, lots of natural gas is going to help renewables. In the short term, maybe there's a competitive pressure, and it will have an impact in terms of price competition, natural gas, power, electricity from gas versus electricity from renewables. But all of the options to balance renewables on power grids that I mentioned, gas turbines. Okay, we have non-peaking gas turbines today, but peaking gas turbines in the future and so on. Natural gas and renewables are really natural complements on a power system. In my view, the power system of the future is going to be renewables and natural gas and nothing else. We're looking at 2050. And so I don't believe in the 100% renewables either. I think 70% renewables, 30% natural gas, 80% renewables, 20% natural gas. That seems reasonable to me. Natural gas is the perfect balancing agent for renewables, and it's also very cheap. And so I think in the long term, all this natural gas can't help but strengthen the case for large shares of renewables. It will make international natural gas prices cheaper. Japan, for example, will be more willing to continuing to import LNG, and if prices remain low. And that will actually help renewables in the long term in Japan. Now, in the short term, in the next 5 or 10 years, what will happen? I don't know.
Flat spot.
I don't know. You know, we'll see how that works out. But I have to say that even if natural gas is cheaper at the wholesale level, in terms of wholesale spot market power generation, solar PV can still compete at the retail price level. You cut out the transmission, you cut out the generation, you cut out everything else. Solar PV, electricity prices are not going to go down because natural gas is cheap and available, right? So, you know, if we look at electricity prices today and solar PV is beginning to compete with those retail electricity prices, I don't think it's going to matter that much on the wholesale level for solar PV. Maybe wind is going to have the biggest problem. And there we have to look at continued policy for wind and other things. And it is a very serious question. When I ask people in China and in the US, what do you think about the future of renewable energy? And many said, well, it depends on shale gas. It does, you know, it depends on shale gas. And they acknowledge that. If you look at Annex 3 of the report, there's a list of 18 variables that affect the future of renewable energy that are used in scenario modeling, that are used as assumptions: GDP, energy demand, oil prices, all of these 18 variables, and shale gas is one of these 18. Okay. So how important it is relative to all the 18, you know, you can figure that out, or you can think about that. And it's a good question. Yeah.
Can you go back to the slide that shows the organizations, private sector types of companies? Yeah, so let me ask you a question. There's a lot of students in this room and elsewhere that really want to get involved in renewables, that are looking for opportunities. Based on your extensive interviews and knowledge, where do you see the short-term opportunities for students who want to get into renewables?
Yeah.
What do you recommend in your career center?
Yeah. Well, there's a lot that has to happen on power grids. So, you know, and I'm not just talking about storage, but all of the kinds of integration options. If we look at all of these things, and this requires yes, it's a combination of engineering and economics, but it's also a different way of thinking about power grids, a different way of conceiving of microgrids. You know, the Rocky Mountain Institute scenario shows a U.S. that's half microgrids. So the U.S. in the year 2050 is basically powered halfway by this series of interlinked and interconnected microgrids. So how is that going to work? Not just technically, but socially, in terms of business models, in terms of how that power is managed, who owns it, how it's built and operated, and so on. So I think sort of, you know, this is one area of policy, and what policy can do for that. And sort of I think this is a major area. If I had to point to another one, I would certainly say in terms of building integration, and a lot of this has to happen at a local level. So you know, markets for all of these things, for wood pellets, even for a lot of these components, really you can think of sort of local manufacturing, local business models, local markets for these things. There's a lot of work to do to get this to work cheaply in various ways, if you're entrepreneurial in ment or in terms of the components, the integration issues themselves. I'm not sure that they're pointing to specific applications for students just graduating, but you know, sort of when I think about those are the main areas of influence, of what's really going to start to change things. And I mentioned also new sources of finance, for example, community funds, and this sort of whole range of business models. And we find, you know, for an example, in Australia, there is a citizen-owned wind farm. Actually, 2 wind turbines, in a group of citizens in a local community got together, and they all bought shares in these wind turbines, $5,000 minimum, except for low-income people. I think you could buy in at $100 shares. And they installed and built 2 wind turbines that are community-owned, and they receive the power, and they receive the profits from this. And it was a community development model in which, you know, they can see what they own, and they are more willing to have the wind farm, you know, in their community because they get the benefit from it directly. And I think you find a lot of these sort of community-level, community development efforts coming out, especially for microgrids. If we talk about heating, you know, solar heating, it may not be very efficient to have an individual solar heater on each rooftop, but rather you have a solar heating system for a so-called district heating system for a group of buildings or a small neighborhood or, you know, an apartment building or something. And so how that comes together in terms of how that's owned and operated and managed, it requires business models. The owner associations may have to be involved, all these sorts of things. So, I mean, for those who are sort of more interested in the business side of things, you will find companies that are doing this, various types of companies. What's the solar company that there's a company now doing solar leasing, basically. So you don't have to buy the panels, you can lease it from them and you pay a monthly fee. There's a few of them there, yeah, now. But we're seeing these more and more mobility services. And, you know, I used to, I think I left out a slide that's towards the end, but, oops. Yeah. Chapter 4 of the report talks about renewables at the local or city or community level. And you find a lot of things happening at local levels. And you know, this is one area where people can get involved with the community, with the city government, with groups in cities. You know, whether it's low energy buildings, electric vehicle infrastructure, very interesting, charging points for electric vehicles. Mitsubishi makes an electric vehicle, the IMI-EV, and they export it, and they find that Norway is their best market for these. And the reason is because Norway has developed at the local level initiatives for charging points throughout this is policy, this is community involvement. And so actually Norway is one of the best markets for electric vehicles so far because you can find these charging points everywhere. If you read chapter 4 of the report, I think it gives you some ideas of more of the local level. And to be honest, your question is something I haven't thought about very much, so by the 6th time that I give this to an undergraduate audience, maybe I'll have a good answer. But I don't have actually a very good one right now. Yeah. Right now, the charging times for most things, like I would say the Chevy Volt, I don't know exactly what it is, but I mean, it's on the order of 5, 6, 7, 8 hours for charging. You can get fast charging, but you need 220 volts instead of a normal 120 volt outlet, and most houses don't have that, at least not in the garage. And so there's this big push now for fast charging and 220 volts. But we're not there yet. We can get to the point where electric vehicle charging could happen on the order of 1 hour or even less than an hour. And at that point, you can really start to integrate electric vehicles with the power grid, because if you're charging a vehicle up overnight or during the daytime while you're at work or at school, if you can charge that vehicle within an hour, then the utility company can decide when that hour is. And it can use that for balancing variable renewables. So if there's an hour where the wind is down, where the wind is up, it can use that extra power from the wind to charge a whole lot of vehicles that are just sitting there waiting to be charged. The utility decides when they get charged, if they can be charged in an hour any time during this period. But that's not the case yet. So we're not there in terms of battery technology. I mean, the best solution right now in terms of existing battery technology is small, light vehicles. And we're seeing a whole range of vehicle types. In India, they have really small compressed air vehicles. You can charge up the vehicle with compressed air using an electric compressor. So that's a form of electricity, electric vehicle, but it actually runs on compressed air. It's not as efficient, but it's small and quite cheap. China, as I said, lots of cheap electric motor scooters and bicycles and so on running on batteries. And so we're seeing sort of the low end of things, actually in developing countries, emerge in which you can get 30, maybe 40, 50 miles on a charge. But that's it. OK, so for some uses, that's enough. If you're commuting or if you're going to someplace nearby. In Japan, nobody drives long distances. There's no inner city car travel. Everybody takes the train or flies. If you have a car, you're using it just for driving around cities, basically, or city to suburb and back. The US is, of course, very different than that. There's lots of inner-city automobile travel, but that's actually an unusual phenomenon, globally speaking. So the US is actually going to be in trouble in terms of the use of electric vehicles until there is this large range. But Amory Lovins makes the point, if you make vehicles really cheap and light, really lightweight, carbon fiber, small, very efficient, you can get very good performance and very low cost on existing battery technology.
With a high degree of safety.
Okay, with a high degree of safety, thank you. You can't drive 200 miles, but this requires a rethinking of transportation and mobility services, quote unquote. What do we really need from this? Maybe with car sharing, maybe with more of the zip cars and other kinds of models, leasing and other kinds of things. We don't all need to own a car, and we don't need to have every single car capable of driving 300 miles on a charge. We could have 80% of our vehicle fleet with a 50 or 100 mile range, and then 20% of the fleet which is used for longer trips, which might have longer ranges. And different ways of plug-in hybrids and pure electrics and a whole range of vehicle types and technologies. So the one thing that came from this is one size fits all is not going to be the future of transport anymore. It's this proliferation of many different types of vehicles and fuels and uses and services and business models and ownership models for all of this. And I think that's pretty clear. I mean, I really do see the future of passenger travel anyway, becoming completely electric in the long term. Freight, shipping, airline travel, those are probably going to be the very last things to be weaned away from fossil fuels. I mean, when I look at fossil fuel use in the year 2050, I see it going all for heavy trucks, freight, shipping, and air travel. I don't see much alternatives for those right now, unless you have 4 days to fly to Europe in a passenger dirigible or passenger airship, powered by solar-powered propellers. Okay, maybe we will see those. They're doing that for freight now. The U.S. military and companies in Europe are actually building these airships for freight transport, sort of could even be drone, humanless, flight. But so it's interesting to think about that in terms of transport, fossil fuels versus renewables versus biofuels, and some mixture. If you see in these scenarios, you'll see all these different vehicle types and fuel types. Yeah. There's one more question, or should we close? There's this fellow in the back had his hand up before, or this fellow did. I don't know. It's up to you if you want it. In the back, then?
Yeah, thanks for your presentation. I really like how optimistic you are about the potential for renewables, and I do agree that we have plenty of room for growth before we're running into problems as far as needing a lot more storage on the grid. But you did use Germany and Denmark as examples where they have really aggressive renewable energy penetration goals. And I was wondering, that's kind of like saying there's a collection of states in the United States where they're connected to the rest of the grid. They have other countries around them that can support them with conventional fuel. So I was wondering what you think a challenge is going forward, and what action should be taken as far as being able to maintain reliability with high penetration of renewables.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, Germany is a special case because they have all this hydropower from Norway they can buy, and they're right in the center of all the European grids. And so, there's been this big debate, okay, now that we're doing all renewables and no nuclear, does that mean we're buying nuclear power from France to stabilize our grid and all of this? And it turns out they're not doing it. If you look at the power flows, the power is flowing through Germany from France, but it's actually not staying there. So that's an interesting case. Denmark is very different because they are quite isolated in terms of their total grid. And they're really integrating electricity and heating together. They have all these combined heat and power plants using biomass and other fuels, gas. And they're actually balancing heat supply, natural gas, and electricity all together. So when the wind is up, they turn the heat supply off. And then they have enough heat storage that it's okay to turn the heat supply off for a few hours. When the wind goes down, they turn the heat supply back on because that generates more electricity too. And then they can charge up the heat storage. So each country is very different in terms of its grid and what it can do with all these options. You're absolutely right. No, each grid is the situation in different countries is very different. And then if you look at individual U.S. states or collections of states and so on, I'm not as familiar with the grid situation here in the U.S., but I understand that there are these sort of very small grid balancing regions throughout the western U.S., and that's not really doing justice to the potential for balancing large amounts of renewables. If you have a lot of wind in New Mexico and wind in Wyoming, for example, and there was a strong interconnection, and one was high and one was low, then on average you'd have a fairly constant output. So you're balancing with anti-correlation wind resources across different regions, different states, as long as you have enough transmission, and as long as they're all part of the same balancing region. We call it a balancing region. So there's been work at NREL and by others, as I understand, to look at what if you combined all these balancing regions in the western US together into one much larger balancing region, and what would that accomplish, and what would that allow you to do? And that's one of the items on this list, is aggregation of balancing regions, more central, in a sense, control of that, or central balancing authority. And so that's one thing. I mean, all these sort of individual utilities have to either learn to merge their resources or literally become one. This gets into the structure of utility regulation and ownership and state-level regulations, and the state public utility commissions then have to start interacting with each other, and I don't know that they do that very much. And so you get into the federal versus state thing as well. So it's complicated, but it's not really a technical problem, is it? It's an institutional and political one, and that's part of the point here, is that these are the big challenges for the future. If we want a lot of renewables, we need to solve these political and institutional issues, and we won't get there without them. I mean, Japan's electricity system has been the same for 50 years. There's been no change in terms of the regulation, the ownership. They never went through restructuring like we did in the US or in Europe, and renewables in large quantities will never happen in Japan until that electric utility system changes, and until it's unbundled and transmission is separate from generation and so on. That's very clear. So yes, I mean, all these changes do have to happen, and it's a question of pointing out the really important ones, and that we don't wait for the technologies. There's no waiting for technology anymore. That's really not the issue, and I think people need to hear that message. And you said I'm very optimistic. Thank you. My speaking, I think, conveys that. But let me also say that this report, that everything in here, these are not my ideas. Everything that's in here comes from somebody else, from the people I interviewed or from the scenarios themselves. I just put it all together into some meaningful way to read it through in 40 pages. If you want my own views, you can read the 2-page epilogue, speaking personally at the very end, in which I separated my views from those in the report. Okay, there's a lot of overlap, but I tried to do this in a credible way, in an objective way, to put all this together. You find a lot of statements by oil companies in here saying renewables will never amount to anything, the storage problem is too big, the costs are going to remain too high. I tried to include all those views in there in some objective sense. So anyway, you can judge for yourself how well I did. Yeah.
Thanks, Eric. Cool.